Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to discuss the parts of the brain and the cranial nerve attachments. The objective of this class is the identification of the parts of the brain and the identification of the cranial nerve attachment. The identification of the cranial nerve attachment, this is going to be another separate part which we are also going to do after this. Brain is one of the largest, most complex organ in the human body, which is made up of more than 100 billion neurons that communicate with trillions of connections called as synapses. It is having the unique function to regulate and facilitate the vital, complicate physiological and psychological processes in the human body. It is main part of the CNS that lies in the cranial vault, as we had just done the cranial vault, whole of the skull cavity, different bones of the skull, calvaria. This is the major content, this is the only content of the skull vault. Okay, it is also called as the encephalon. Its surface is convoluted. It is not a simple smooth surface, rather it is a convoluted surface, which means it is having certain depressions and certain elevations. The depressions are known as the sulci or the sulci, and the elevations are the gyri. So these are the gyri. As you can see, this elevated portion, more prominent portion, this is the gyri, and this depression is known as the sulci, which are just the inward depression. Brain consists of the cerebrum. This cerebrum is inbuilt contains of the cerebral hemisphere, like this is the cerebral hemisphere. This is the superior lateral aspect of the whole of the brain, and this is the mid sagittal view of the brain, or the lateral view of the brain, and this is the mid sagittal view of the brain. As you can see, the cerebrum is consisted of the cerebral hemisphere and the diencephalon. So this is the region more or less for the diencephalon present over here. Apart from that, it is consisted of the brainstem. So this is the brainstem. As you can see, brainstem is again consisted of the three parts. First is the midbrain, which is the small superior most part of the brainstem, which is in direct contact with the cerebral hemispheres or the cerebrum, the diencephalon basically. Then the in between there is the pons, and then there is the medulla oblongata. Apart from the brainstem, there is a connected structure, means like there is a one more structure which is in connection with the brainstem, that is known as the cerebellum. Now this brain is covered by the three meninges from outer to inner, that is the dura mater, arachnoid matter, and then the pia mater. And there is the dural certain dural sheaths which are going to cover it at a certain point, which has been already completed. Now in between these meningeal coverings, there is the presence of the CSF in the subarachnoid region, which is going to provide it a particular protection. Brain weighs about 350 grams in newborns and approx 1400 grams in adults. Now we are going to move on to the next slide. This is the superior lateral aspect of the cerebrum. Before discussing the lobes or the parts of the brain, I will discuss some of the major depressions or the sulci and the gyri of the brain region. So first of all, starting with the sulcus parts. As you can see, this is the one such major sulcus which is very much important, which is known as the central sulcus. Okay, this you should know each and every time when you are just looking at the brain specimen. So this is the central sulcus. Then this is the lateral sulcus. This is the lateral sulcus, which is again very much important. And then posteriorly there is this very small sulcus that is known as the parieto-occipital sulcus. This is again very much important. Now before going on to the lobes part, first of all discuss about the how these lobes are being named. So these are named according to the bones which are present in that contextual area. So first of all, this is the frontal pole or the anterior pole, and this is the occipital pole, and this is the temporal pole of the brain corresponding to the different lobes. So first of all, going towards the now moving on to the lobes part, starting with the frontal lobe. So this is the central sulcus. Frontal lobe is extending from the central sulcus till the frontal pole. So this much region is going to be called as the frontal lobe. Now moving on to the parietal lobe. It extends from the central sulcus to the occipital lobe. This is the occipital lobe, or you can say that the this parieto-occipital sulcus, but the region of the brain tissue is going to be present superior to the this lateral sulcus. We can say that this is the margin. So this much region, this patch of the tissue, brain tissue, is going to be called as the parietal lobe. Now moving on to the temporal lobe. It extends from the temporal pole to the occipital pole, lying inferior to the lateral sulcus. So this is the inferior sulcus, this is the temporal pole, this is the occipital pole. So this much region is going to be called as the temporal lobe. After that, there is the occipital lobe. So in this, the line has to be drawn from the parieto-occipital sulcus up till the pre-occipital notch. As you can see, this region, this one. I'm just going to draw a very simple line over here. So this line, which is just coming all along the parieto-occipital sulcus and the this pre-occipital notch. So this region is going to be called as the occipital lobe. Now I'm just going to discuss about the different parts of these lobes in the superolateral aspect. So first of all, starting with the this frontal lobe. So as you can see, it is extending from the this central sulcus. One thing I want to make you clear, that this is the sulcus. So just corresponding to that sulcus, there will be certain kind of elevation or the prominent structure that is known as the gyri. So this the gyri which is present anterior to the central sulcus is known as the precentral gyrus. The gyrus which is present posterior to the central sulcus is known as the postcentral gyrus. So this is the precentral gyrus, and then there is again a one sulci which is present anterior to this precentral gyrus, that is known as the precentral sulcus. So from here, from the precentral sulcus, there are the again two sulcus which can be seen over here. As you can see, this sulcus, this is known as the superior frontal sulcus. This is known as the superior frontal sulcus. And then this is the one more major sulcus which is known as the inferior frontal sulcus. Inferior frontal sulcus. So the part of the brain or the part of the frontal lobe which is present above the superior frontal sulcus is known as the superior frontal gyrus. The part which is present below the inferior frontal sulcus is known as the inferior frontal gyrus, and the part which is in between them is known as the middle frontal gyrus. Now we move on to the temporal lobe. So this is the temporal lobe. This is the lateral sulcus of the sylvius, and this is the demarcation for the posterior this occipital lobe. So again we are having two sulci which are just more or less parallel to the lateral sulcus. This is the superior temporal sulcus, this is the inferior temporal sulcus. So the part of the this temporal lobe just above the superior temporal sulcus is known as superior temporal gyrus. The part which is below the inferior temporal sulcus is known as the inferior temporal gyrus, and the part in between these two sulci is known as the middle temporal gyrus. After that, we move on to the parietal lobe. So in this is the post central gyrus. Just behind the post central gyrus there is post central sulcus, and then we are having a intraparietal sulcus which is going to divide this parietal lobe into two lobules. So the lobule which is just present superior to this Intraparietal sulcus is known as the superior parietal lobule, and the lobule which is going to present just below this in intraparietal sulcus is going to be called as the inferior parietal lobule. Then there are also certain sulci and gares which are present on the medial aspect, which we are going to do in the upcoming slides. Now, as you can see here, this is the frontal lobe, this is the parietal lobe, this is the occipital lobe, and this is the temporal lobe. Now, there is one more lobe which is just present underneath this, the lateral sulcus. When we are just reflecting out the lateral sulcus from both the sides, we are going to find from one more lobe which is also called as insula. It is also called as central lobe. It is having certain long and the short gyres. So there are different long and the short gyres which are present in this region. Now moving on to the mid-sagittal section. This is the mid-sagittal section view, and we are just going to discuss the remaining sulci and the gyri in this view. So before going to the sulci and the gyri, I just want to fetch your focus on this whitish part. This is the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum is the one of the major commissural fiber. Commissural fibers are the fibers or the neuronal part which are going to provide a connection in between the two cerebral hemisphere, or we can call it as a point of attachment in between the two cerebral hemisphere. So this is the corpus callosum. After that, I just want to fetch your first we are just going to discuss the sulci gyri. So this is the same central sulcus which we had just seen in the superolateral view. This central sulcus is going to end medially in a paracentral lobule. So this is again a gyri or the very lobulated part. So this is the paracentral lobule. Just anterior to the paracentral lobule, there is the medial frontal gyrus. There is the medial frontal gyrus. Apart from that, posterior to the paracentral lobule, there is the precuneus. So this precuneus is the part of the parietal lobe. This is the part of the frontal lobe. Then in the occipital lobe, we are going to have the cuneus region only. So this is the cuneus. So the precuneus is present in between the cuneus and the paracentral lobule. So precuneus is the part of occipital, and the paracentral is again the part of the parietal, and the precuneus is also the part of the parietal lobe. Then there is one more gyrus which is just present parallel to the corpus callosum, which is known as the cingulate gyrus, Now I'm going to, after this, we are going to discuss the other structure of the cerebrum, that is the diencephalon, or the part of the diencephalon. So diencephalon is the part which is present in between the cerebrum and the midbrain. So this whole is the cerebrum and this is the midbrain region. So this is the midbrain and this whole is the cerebrum. So this much part is going to be called as the diencephalon. Apart from the diencephalon, there is one more part which is known as the basal ganglia, which we are also going to see in the upcoming slides. So first of all, just I want to fetch your attention toward this region. It is just a basic overview. So diencephalon is consisted of this much region. This is the part of the diencephalon, and it is just covered by the whole of the cerebrum. Diencephalon is having one cavity in between them, that is known as the lateral ventricle. The diencephalon is going to have a third ventricle cavity in between them. So discussing its structures. So moving from posterior to anterior. Posteriorly, we are having a this part of the diencephalon which is known as the epithalamus. Anterior to the epithalamus, there is the thalamus, and then just anterior to that, there is the hypothalamus region. There is also metathalamus and subthalamus part, which I am not able to show you in this diagram right now. So epithalamus, it is the small part of the diencephalon which is consisted of pineal body. As you can see, this is the pineal gland. So, and after that, pineal gland, can you see this triangular structure? This is the habenular trigone. So these are the two main parts of the epithalamus. Then this is the thalamus part. There are two thalami on the either sides, and in between them there is the third ventricle which is present. I am going to show you this on the next coronal section slide. Okay, and in between them they are connected with the interthalamic adhesion. So this is the interthalamic adhesion. You can see this rounded structure. This is the interthalamic adhesion. Now we are moving more anteriorly. So this is the hypothalamic region. This is going to contain the optic chiasma. This is the optic chiasma region, as the optic nerve is going to end over here. Then these are the mammillary bodies. You can see the rounded structure just above, just near the cerebellar peduncles. This is the mammillary body, and this is the infundibulum part. To the infundibulum there is a gland which is just connected over here. This is known as the pituitary gland. Okay, after that we move on to this slide. So this is the mid sagittal view. As you can see, different structures. So one thing which we had just missed in the last slide is that this is the corpus callosum, and underneath there is a sheath like covering of the corpus callosum. This structure, this empty structure, that is known as the septum pellucidum. So in this diagram we had just removed that covering, that midline wall. So inside this is the cavity which is known as the lateral ventricle, and this is the lateral wall of the lateral ventricle. This is just the wall like structure that is being called as the basal ganglia over here. So the basal ganglia, when we are just cutting this brain in a coronal view, so we can get this kind of picture in which you can see that this is the right hemisphere, this is the left hemisphere, and these are the different lobes which are represented as a different colors. You can see that, and then this is the corpus callosum. This is the site of attachment in between the two cerebral hemisphere. We can see different fibers are running over here. Just below that, this is the two lateral ventricles. Okay, and just under that there is the thalamus. These are the two thalami which are present. In between those two thalami, this is the third ventricle, and then just lateral to this the corpus callosum we are going to have a caudate nucleus. This is just for this demonstration, is just to show you the different parts only. Okay, we are going to discuss them later on in details. And this is the part of the basal ganglia which is known as the globus pallidus and the putamen. Globus pallidus and the putamen, and this in between them intertwinkling fibers which are going to connect with the higher center, these are known as the internal capsule. This is known as the internal capsule. And this is the hippocampal region which we are going to discuss on later on. Now moving on to the parts of the brainstem. So in the parts of the brainstem, we have just cut it out. This is the human specimen of the brainstem. As you can see, this is the midbrain. This is very small segment of the brainstem. It is just present superior to the pons. This is the pons, and this is the medulla oblongata. So this midbrain is going to be consisted of the two pillar-like structures which are known as the cerebral peduncle, cerebral peduncle, and in between them there is a fossa which is known as the interpeduncular fossa. Then there are the different nerves which are having their nucleus lying over there, like third, fourth and fifth cranial nerves. Then in between them, I'm not able to show you that structure over here. We will just discuss it later on, that there is a one cavity which is present in the midbrain region, that is known as the cerebral aqueduct, which is going to connect the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle. I am going to discuss that in further slide, in the later on slide. Now we move on to the pons. This is the large middle part of the brainstem. It is continuous above with the midbrain and below with the medulla oblongata. As you can see, it is continuous with the midbrain and the medulla oblongata. It is named because it forms a bridge between the two cerebral hemisphere by a transverse fibers constituting the middle cerebellar peduncle. So this is the pons which is going to have a bridge like structure, and behind that there will be two bigger cerebellar structure. So this is the ventral view. We are seeing it from the front or the anterior side. and these are the middle cerebellar peduncles. Then there is a median, ventral median sulcus which is present over here. As you can see, there is a groove. This is known as the basilar sulcus, which is just meant for the presence of one artery, which is known as the basilar artery. Therefore, it is known as the basilar sulcus. Now we move on to the medulla oblongata. It is again a cylindrical part and the lower part of the brainstem, and this brainstem is going to be continuous as spinal cord at the level of the foramen magnum. This thing we had discussed at the time of the occipital bone as well, and during the time of the contents of the occipital this foramen magnum. So anteriorly there is the anterior median sulcus. Okay, this is the anterior median sulcus. Just lateral to this anterior median sulcus, there is two prominences or two enlargement, which is known as the pyramid. Pyramid shaped enlargement. These elevation are produced by there are certain fibers which are coming from the higher brain centers and going towards lower aspect, which are known as the corticospinal tracts, which are just passing. So due to that passage of the neuronal fibers, this elevations has been made. Then just lateral to the pyramid, there is again one more elevation on the both side, that is known as the olive. It is made because of the presence of the inferior olivary nucleus, which is present just under the olive. And more lateral to the olive, there is the presence of the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So try to note of these areas. This is very important. Now we move on to the next slide. So this is the posterior such view of the brainstem. So this much region, it is the region of the midbrain. So midbrain is having posteriorly, it is having corpora quadrigemina, which are the four elevations which are just present posterior to the cerebral aqueduct, and that cerebral aqueduct is going to open in this fourth ventricle. This we are going to discuss in detail when we are going to discuss the fourth ventricle. So we will do it later on. And these are the two elevation which are present inferiorly as well as superiorly. Here also two elevations are present. These are going to be very important structure in the path, in the visual and the auditory pathways. Then these are the middle cerebellar peduncles seen from the posterior view, and this we are going to discuss in detail at the time of the fourth ventricle. Okay, so I'm not going to discuss that here. And this is the part of the medulla oblongata. After that, in this is again the coronal section of the brain and the brainstem. So you can see that this is the cerebrum. These are the fibers which are just running upward and downward. This second is the thalamus, and then this is the midbrain, which is just having certain structures, different structures. And then this fourth one is the larger part. This is the pons, this is the medulla oblongata, and this is the sixth part is the top of the spinal cord, which you can see over here. After that, we are going to discuss about the cerebellum. Cerebellum, it is located, this is whole the skull cavity or the calvaria. This is the again the anterior, this is the skull cavity, and this is the anterior cranial cavity, middle cranial cavity, and this is the posterior cranial cavity. Okay, or the posterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and the anterior cranial fossa. So we are going to discuss the posterior cranial fossa over here. So this is the cerebellum, which is present in the posterior cranial fossa. It is attached to the brainstem by the three cerebellar peduncles. So they are the three cerebellar peduncles. From the midbrain, there is superior cerebellar peduncle. From pons, there is the middle cerebellar peduncle, and from the medulla part, there is the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So as you can see that it is being differentiated from the occipital and the temporal lobe by a sheath which is known as the tentorium cerebelli. We had just discussed that this is the tentorium cerebelli, and in between them there is again one more dural sheath that is known as the falx cerebelli. This is the falx cerebelli and this is the falx cerebri. So we had just removed out the brain from the calvaria. So you can see that this is the mid sagittal section again. So this is the superior medullary, superior cerebellar peduncle, which is just attaching from this midbrain towards the cerebellum. So you can see that this cerebellum is going to is made up of certain hemisphere. There are the two cerebellar hemisphere. We can see only one hemisphere over here. There is a vermis midline structure which is just dividing into two parts. We are going to see it again in the next further slide. So in between the brain stem and the cerebellum there is one cavity which is present. This is the fourth ventricle. This is the fourth ventricle. As you can see, this is the lateral ventricle. There are the two lateral ventricle on the either side. Then it is going to be in connection with the third ventricle just lying over here, and then it is going to be empty into the fourth ventricle. Now, see in this diagram, these are going to show the different parts of the cerebellum. I'm not going to discuss that much detail because it is not required right now. So it is just meant to show you the different part of the cerebellum. So there is the vermis, which is just the midline structure. It is just a worm-like appearance. That's why it is known as the vermis. Okay. So then there are the two cerebellar hemispheres, and then there are certain lobes. So there are the again three lobe: anterior lobe, posterior lobe, and the flocculonodular lobe. So this anterior lobe and posterior lobe is again going to be discussed in detail, as there are the primary fissure. They are the different fissures. Okay. In similarity with the cerebrum, the cerebellum is also it is also having a convoluted surface, means that there are certain fissures and there are certain elevations like structures. Okay, but fissures are very much prominent here. So there are certain three main fissures which are going to divide the cerebellar surface into the different lobes. So for the discussion meant, this is the primary fissure which is going to divide whole of the cerebellum into the anterior lobe and the remaining in the posterior lobe. So this is the anterior lobe and this is the posterior lobe. This is the from the back view. So this is the front view or the anterior view. So this whole is the posterior lobe, as you can see, but there is a slight stalked, like जैसे एक पत्ता एक लटक रहा है साइड में से from the cerebellum. So this is a stalked kind of structure which is just been bent over here, which is just attached with the rest part of the posterior lobe, that is known as the flocculonodular lobe. This is not in direct contact. This is just a remaining suspended part. Okay, and this remaining structure is going to be called as the empty structure over here is going to be called as the fourth ventricle. Okay, or the site for the fourth ventricle. We are going to discuss it later on. So for the revision, basic revision, we are going to call it end of the lecture by this summarizing. Just this is yellow color, this shape is, this is the frontal lobe, this is the temporal lobe, this is the parietal lobe, this is the occipital lobe, this whole is the brainstem part, and this is the cerebellum. I hope you understand my lecture. Thank you.